End tags. There's a bunch of them, and it's time to rank them in the only objective way possible, a tier list. Now, to be clear, an end tag is a country that, when formed, stops you forming other countries. So once it has been formed, you're not forming anything else. Now, are there exceptions? Of course. Rome, for example, is a super end tag, aka it has an end tag that other end tags can form, and things like the Holy Roman Empire tag are formed by, well, an HRE reform, not by decision, and hence you can form them after forming another end tag. There are also specific nation upgrade end tags. For example, Ethiopia is an end tag, but it's allowed to form one specific tag, and Yuan is an end tag that can form the Mongol Empire. With that said, I'm ranking these with a couple of things in mind. 1. How strong are they as a country? So, how good are their missions, ideas, and unique buffs? And 2. How fun or, well, unique are they to play? Now, 2 is purely subjective, but for 1, I will be always considering both multiplayer and single player, where applicable. Anyway, enough disclaimers, let's get to ranking these, but before we do, a like on the video would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. But enough self-shilling, let's begin with Axum. Here it is, this is this tag here if you didn't know what it was. Now, if you don't know what it was, I'm not going to blame you. It's not a very well-known end tag. This is the actual Ethiopia special form board that you can get access to, but you don't have to be Ethiopia to form it. You can form it as, well, anyone around in the region with the correct primary culture. In terms of missions, nothing too especially outstanding. I find Ethiopia has some pretty unique stuff going on with their Coptic mechanics, which is cool, and hence I think it's pretty neat. But Axum doesn't exactly have that going for it. I mean, they basically continue it. In terms of unique ideas, they get some promised war scroll reduction, and they have 15 governing capacity going for them, which is quite nice, and I think it's their main unique relatively buff compared to other countries. They of course have the usual 5% discipline that you expect to have, but it's nice to have it, again, present in your ideas, and nothing else that stands out too much. Some tech cost isn't bad as well from their ideas again. Nothing way too fancy here. They're just not great as far as end tags go. There are a lot of better options around them is my issue. The gov cap is pretty unique, but I find in single player you don't really struggle with gov cap that much because courthouses and, well, town halls are pretty strong and are the best way to deal with gov cap, but for 15% is definitely not bad and, well, helps you have more states, so can't knock that down too much. I think their main other unique thing is war score cost versus other religions. 15% is nice to have, and I think that's where it has to be noticed. It's a nice buff. There are other things that have war score cost or war score cost versus other religions in them as well, but it's still a good modifier to have. Promise war score cost is a good buff. They're not too weak for the rest of their ideas. Again, 5 discipline isn't bad. They get some manpower. They're not great, but they're not awful, and I think they really struggle to justify anything above a C tier in my opinion. With that said, though, we move on to our next tag, Andalusia. Well, this is where it gets interesting. I think they're a pretty unique game plan as a general way it goes. You're basically undoing the Reconquista. You have to reconquer Iberia as a Muslim, and you can go ahead and form it. They have some pretty nice stuff going for them. In terms of unique things, they get 100% vassal force contribution, which works really well with colonial nation gameplays. They also have some pretty neat military buffs. 15% fire damage received is pretty cool. They have a pretty nifty 15% morale of armies, but they don't have discipline in their ideas, which I think should be noticed, so they're not that strong in that regard. Full creation cost is always good for single player as well, and in honesty, Spain campaigns I find myself are quite fun. It's not as brain-numbing as other colonial campaigns like Portugal, looking at you Portugal specifically, where you just colonize, forgive and forget. And with Andalusia, you're actually having to do other things around that. You're conquering other territories, you know, quite good stuff. And for me personally, I think Andalusia is a pretty nice campaign to have overall. However, I think it's held back that even though it's got some unique stuff in it, like your vassal force contribution and fire damage received, it's not necessarily strong. I mean, in terms of other utility groups, you pick up some goods produced and idea costs. That's okay. And the missions aren't the worst. There are worse missions out there, let's be clear. But they could be a lot better as well. I think this is really held up by the fact that Spain and Iberia in general is a nice area to play, and there's a bit of work involved in forming the tag. So for me, however, that does make it into B tier. After that, though, we move on to the Angevin Empire. The Angevin Empire is quite interesting. It's one of the optional formables that you have access to as England. You have 2 options there. You can go form GB, or you can form the Angevin Empire, or you can go ahead and play it as Scotland or Ireland and form into England into these routes as well. So basically, it's I'm playing in the British Isles territory. What are my options? I think they're really carried by their missions, having given them a lot of personal unions over Europe, so that's honestly quite powerful and should not be ignored. The same 15% governing capacity present in Axum is there as well, and you have the same discipline, but To top that off, you have 10 years of personal integration counter, which is quite nice and has, I think, is a pretty unique modifier, even if it's not necessarily too strong. You also pick up some core creation cost, which is a very strong modifier for specifically single player. I also find that compared to playing in somewhere like Ethiopia, again, to have the previous comparison, England is quite a fun area to play in. You have quite a lot of development. It's a relatively rich area. You're right there in the action for Europe, but you can also have a nice area to fall back into. The mission tree is quite extensive and quite fun. And compared to something like Navarra, which sure also gets a lot of restoration of unions, compared to, well, playing as Navarra, you're not going to have a brain aneurysm actually enforcing these personal unions. It's not going to be trivial. Well, depends on how good you are as a player, I guess. But it's also going to be a lot more doable compared to, again, something like Navarra. So for that reason, I think I think basically Angevin Empire holds up quite a bit better than a lot of other people put them. Now, I don't think they're great. They don't have admin efficiency, which some of the other amazing end tags have. They do get it in their missions, which I think is important to mention, though. So it's a bit deceptive that they don't have it in their ideas. They do pick it up from their mission tree. With that all said, though, it's a relatively powerful tag because of your positioning, but I don't think it's the best. So we have our first entrance into A tier. Now, if the Angevin Empire has been dragged by their pure power, but again, relatively held back by lack of interest, after all, I guess I played in the UK a lot of times, and they're basically just an England campaign. Arabia is quite different to that. They don't have a lot of actual powerful stuff going for them. On first inspections, their main thing they have is +2 missionaries and 3% missionary strength in terms of their unique buffs. They're really good at converting, so they are, well, the best if you're going for a one faith, and that still holds. The issue is that it's very much a Muslim tag as well, and what that means is you're going to get propagate religion, and that's an incredibly powerful missionary strength mechanic that Arabia just doesn't make up for. You also do pick up war cost versus other religions, so it's definitely a very go conquer the world, do a one faith kind of build, and I respect that, and I think that's quite unique. You get some cavalry combat ability and cav ratio, which not the best cavalry tag out there, by far not the best cavalry tag out there, but it's got that going for it at least. And hey, there's some siege ability to throw in for the fun of it as well. You pick up some trade steering, which is also nice for a world conquest, and a yearly armor tradition never hurts. But it's a very weird situation where it's not really that strong of an end tag. But I personally think it's quite an interesting campaign. Arabia's a nice area to play in, and, well, it's a relatively engaging tag. It does normally require admin 20, but that's somewhat mitigated by being able to form it early if you're playing as one of the countries that are meant to form it. So, something like the Rassids. And I think it can be definitely an entertaining campaign. Kind of lacking in the power level department. There are certainly tags that do a lot better than it, but I think it's suddenly been carried by just be the fun campaign overall. So with that reason, I think it's going to be joining the Angevin Empire up in A tier. Now, if we're talking about power levels and fun being the determinants of A tier, this is going to turn around as we get to our next tag. And congratulations if you know what this flag is, because I certainly didn't until I had to, well, check what it was. This is, of course, the flag of Australia. Yes, Australia. No, naturally. Now, I guess it makes sense. If this is an independent colonial nation, they probably don't want to shove the British flag on there, which is weird, because that's kind of what the current Australian... I digress. Regardless, with that, though, they don't get unique missions. They're an end tag, and you're not exactly playing in a fun area. I'm sorry. You're playing in Australia. There's not much going on. And worst part of worst, one of the good things going for Australia is at least there's a lot of room in it. There's a lot of room to build up and have your country. But Australia, because I guess it's so relevant, or for whatever reason, does not have a lot of provinces in the actual base game. There's just not a lot of provinces in Australia. It's like, what, 30 provinces total? Which means that one of the few, I say best is a very strong word, one of the few things you have going for you is minus 15 dev cost. It's great, but you don't have a lot of dev. Now, for me, of course, you might think, oh, 15% dev cost, that's a lot of dev cost. Most countries, if they have dev costs of 10, surely I can play them for the dev cost. Well, you can, but there's better options. In terms of a bit more engaging colonial gameplay, at least consider Alaska or Canada. You'll have style points for sure. Or if you want to play that with, not having boredom out of your mind, I'd recommend a Geneva campaign, because, again, they're quite small, but they get 15% dev cost in their ideas as well. And honestly, I think they're quite a fun campaign. Otherwise, no unique missions, pretty much no flavor in a very boring area, combined with an idea group selection that is... sad at best. You don't have discipline. Your entire army quality can be summarized as 10% shock damage and 10 of common ability. You do get some marine force summit, but you don't get any buffs to those marines. So those marine force summits are just a waste of your sailors that take extra shock damage. Congratulations. And you get a colonist. What are you colonizing in Australia? More Australia? Yeah, no. It's By the time you get there, it's way too late to colonize anyway. The US probably finished off colonizing the entire world. So unless you're intending to colonize the west part of Alaska, you're not going to be using that colonist for much, would be my guess. I guess it's useful if you want to finish colonizing Australia while you still have colonial ideas. I mean, it's just not great. Not a lot going for it, and I think a very comfortable detail without much debate from me. With that, though, we move on to Bharat. Now, Bharat's an interesting option. Bharat is is the India form ball if you are not Sunni, as I think is the best way of summarizing it. Each of the 5 main Indian culture groups have access to it, so that's your that's the ones down south, the ones near the middle. Yeah, I mean, I forgot their names basically, but yeah, everyone in India can form Bharat, which is good. In terms of gameplay, I think it's a relatively fun area to play in India. There's a lot of development, there's a lot of tags, there's a lot of flavor. Would recommend. They're honestly quite fun, and we do have a 5% admin efficiency in our missions. With that said, though, it's in a very weird spot. I think Bharat is the way to go for single player. Because of the 5% admin efficiency pretty much, and you get some years of separatism which helps conquest, but it's not too great there. The other issue I have with Bharat is Hindustan is a better form ball if you're going for pure army quality if you're playing in the India area. You don't really need army quality in single player, I guess, so it's a weird comparison. I think for single player, Bharat is probably the form ball to go, but it's something we can get to later when debating, well, Hindustan specifically. For me, though, it's just a very strong tag. You're in a very nice area, India. There's a lot of money to be made here, a lot of development, just hence a fun area to play with, and I think that helps the tag quite a bit. And hey, the ideas aren't exactly bad. 5% admin efficiency, you pick up your 5% discipline as before. There's some tech costs in there, some promoted cultures help with the fact that you've united a subcontinent. You know, some pretty good stuff. And if you're going for your separatism, again, reduction, stacking, then Bharat can help you with that. That all said and done, though, I think there are better end tags just out there, so even though it's consistently very nice and a pretty decentable campaign, I can't really put it above 8 here. I know it's a bit weird putting something at admin efficiency again, not an S tier, but we're talking about end tags here. The competition is pretty stiff. There are some absolute monsters out here, so I hope you understand my judgment. With that said, though, we move on to someone that's going to be quite interesting, Brazil. Now, it has been a bit of a meme recently to say that you should come to Brazil, but having taken a look at their ideas and their complete lack of flavor, and honestly being a relatively boring place, you should not go to Brazil. You're getting some really weird modifiers, and I think this is some of the issues with a lot of the formables, is that one of the things you get with your colonial nations, if you are playing as a colonist, as a colonial nation, is provinces that are heathen and heretic don't give you any debuffs, and that's quite powerful. And this nation doesn't have it, but we're going to see it with other colonial nations later. They replace that with some buffs to tolerance of heretics and heathens, which I don't want. I just want to not worry about tolerance and heathens for colonial nations. Now, this country doesn't have it. What that means is that, let's say Portugal's colonizing and they flip their religion over, you're going to get screwed over. You're going to get screwed over by other religions natively. And to make up for that, the best thing inside your idea group is 10% goods produced for an end tag. You have pretty much nothing going for you. Your only military buff, you don't have discipline, is 10% infantry common ability, and you have no missions. There is very little for you to, well, do in the area as well. Most of your country is wasteland. I'm talking about the Amazon jungle, of course, but, you know, that's a separate debate. Your trade is terrible. You're just not strong, and honestly, I don't think anyone's ever started a Brazil campaign and went, yes, I'm having fun here. I think without much controversy, honesty at all, Brazil is going to be coming very comfortably, joining Australia in D tier. After that, though, we move on to a recent favourite of everyone's, Byzantium. Everyone's tried a Byzantium campaign, everyone under the sun. They are not exactly weak as well. They had a rework recently. 2% missionary strength and some Unity Patriarch authority is also quite good in terms of if you want to play around your religion. And, well, as Byzantium, you're definitely playing around orthodoxy. With that said, you still have the +3 tolerance to the true faith, which is one of the best sources of tolerance to the true faith. So if you want to stack that, that's also your friend there. You have your discipline as before, and 25% CCR is very, very nice and should not be knocked down. And that's a lot of core creation cost though. Now, is it a very powerful mission tree? At the moment, yes. It didn't used to be great, even though it had a Purple Phoenix pre-ordered DLC for it. Ever since the last Domination update, it's had some very powerful stuff in their mission tree. Which, I mean, can be respected as, of course, Byzantium, a crowd favourite. It's a unique campaign, for certain as well, and I think you should do it if you haven't, honestly. For a lot of people, everyone memeing about, ooh, Byzantium good, ooh, Byzantium, Byzantium videos on YouTube, ooh, that's a very popular topic for certain. I don't think if you remove the everyone loves Rome LARP from the debate, it's that necessarily strong. But I think that's also part of the appeal, in some sense, that you are playing this old wannabe rump state that is recovering and reforging its empire, to some extent. So I do respect it in that regard, at least. And I have to admit that the ideas are certainly not bad. There's a lot worse ones on the list. We don't get the admin efficiency, but there's a huge amount of events, there's a huge amount of flavor. It's genuinely quite a fun campaign, and if you haven't done it yourself, I would recommend it. It's known as a hard start. I don't think it's as a hard start as it used to be, and I think it's certainly a lot more doable nowadays. But it's also done in a weird way where if you are playing someone like the Ottomans, or the Ottomans do exist in your games, you're not getting too many, if any, old history scenarios where Byzantium does this weird comeback or something. The Ottomans are still pretty consistently winning this engagement. So, in that extent, I think I respect the game decisions there. It doesn't make Byzantium this predestined state that always comes back. So with that said, however, and the general campaign, I think with Byzantium, and this is probably going to be slightly controversial, I can already imagine the comments. I think it's a great campaign, and there's some powerful stuff in there for certain. But I don't quite think Byzantium's going to make it into S tier, so into A it goes. There are just better Eng Tags out there. I'm sorry. With that said, let's move on to a hopefully not controversial one. Canada. It's awful. I mean, and that's just kind of all there is to say to it. Every other nation, everything that has going for it is done by other countries better. Again, this is one of the cases of a former colonial nation that had no tolerance of heretics and heathens picking up positive tolerance of heretics. Great. I don't want to have problems with tolerance of heretics and heathens. You get a colonist, which is nice. The problem is you're colonizing Canada. Do you even want to own that place? You get some production efficiency and minus 15 land attrition. It's probably your only real unique buff, 15% land attrition. And you get some ship cost reductions and a bit of trade steering. It's just bad. The buffs aren't strong. The unique country isn't great. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, Canada has a pretty nice flag in real life, so I don't know why it uses this awful thing here in the game as well. Yeah, it's just not got anything really going for it. I think it's the best of summarizing Canada. And for that reason alone, I'm going to be putting Canada into D tier as well, where it belongs. With that said, though, we move on to the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth does have two forms, as it were. There is an alternative form of the Commonwealth when formed by Lithuania. The Lithuanian version isn't awful. You still have your discipline and the normal Commonwealth stuff, and your unique buff for being the Commonwealth Lithuanian Commonwealth is that you get 15% gov cap as your ambition, which again is quite nice and has to be mentioned. With that said, though, the Commonwealth exists in a weird space, because the main buff of the Commonwealth is that forming it as Poland gives you Lithuania for free, which is a lot of annexations and it's quite nice. The problem is, of course, that taking the personal union as Poland comes with its own sets of, well, sacrifices, like taking the Sejm and all the other fun and games revolved around that. So much so that there's an argument to be made to just not take the Sejm and just play Poland as a normal country and conquer Lithuania conventionally. And I think the issue here is that Poland is not an Eng Tag. And Poland pretty much gets you everything that you want out of the PLC without being an Eng Tag. Forming Poland means that you get access to your Win Hussars, so you get your best cavalry in the game, memes, done, no worries there, with the 30% cavalry combat ability and the may recruit to Win Hussars. You get your discipline from Poland, and what's great with Poland is you also have access to morale, which weirdly enough, you actually lose morale of armies when you form the Commonwealth for the Commonwealth ideas. You do make up for it somewhat though with a monthly admin point and some infantry combat ability, so that's not to be dismissed, but I find if you're doing a cavalry build, you're probably just better off staying Poland, taking the morale of armies instead on your cavalry and just not bothering with infantry once you get a 100% ratio, which again isn't trivial but is somewhat doable as Poland. With that said though, it's definitely not a bad tag, and it has some pretty unique flavor and stuff going on in their missions, including some mill tactics, which is worth a mention in my opinion. So it's not a great campaign, and, well, I want to rephrase. It is a good campaign. I think Poland campaigns are fun and should be suggested. But in the context of other end tags, there are, well, better options. And even though it can hold its own with 30% cavalry combat ability, I think the main thing that holds down the specifically Lithuanian end tag is the fact that you can just achieve everything you want by doing Poland and leaving the end tags open. Like, you can not be an end tag and just be Poland and have 90% of the things you want from the Lithuania, well, features list, pretty much. And I think the fact that you can basically just play Poland and be Poland almost knocks down Lithuania as a peg. Almost knocks down the Commonwealth as a peg, because why form it if you can just, well, be Poland? Anyway, enough saying being Poland. I think you've heard me say that enough times. What's the final placement? For me, I think it goes into B tier. And again, it's mostly because of how much Poland can achieve things by being it. With that said, though, we now move on to our new person from the east, added as a possible formation for Persia. If you are Zoroastrian and want to return to your Zoroastrian roots, Aranshar. Very nice, get your Persia LARP, who doesn't love it? Not a lot of unique buffs to it. Now, the mission tree really makes up for that. The mission tree is completely broken, and in terms of unique busted mechanics, yeah, you get unique busted mechanics. 10% discipline monuments are just little sprinklings of the most overpowered stuff you can have. I'm looking at buttons that can generate dev out of thin air. Well, you do have to spend monarch points, so you're thinking, oh, it's basically a dev button. But you have to bear in mind that if every single province in your country is 60 dev, instead of spending 200 monarch points on a dev click, you're spending like 50 dip for 3 dev clicks on 60 dev provinces. It can be ridiculously powerful when abused. And your ideas aren't exactly bad. They're very unique. You get 20% overextension impact modifier, which sounds great. My issue is that it's not good. Like, if you're really heavily overextended, 20% overextension impact modifier is what, going to save you a month before the rebels rise up anyway. Great. Like, they're going to rise up anyway. You hit 7k overextension, right? That's just how they're going to work. So I find that modifier, while unique, not good overall. But it's important to mention that I guess it can prevent the old rebellion here and there, which saves you a couple battles, which means you can have more troops dedicated to the front. But you know what saves you more troops dedicated to the front? Army quality. And you know what has a lot more army quality? Persia, which we'll get to later. So for me, I almost think I prefer the Persian ideas compared to the Aranshar ideas. But what they do have going for them, of course, is the pretty unique tier 1 government reform, the 3 royal fires, which is quite strong. And the fact that Zoroastrian is a really powerful tag. And of course, again, you're playing Persia. So it's a fun campaign. It's a very powerful campaign. Persia's incredibly powerful on current patch. It's probably one of the premier tags benefiting from the power creep of the recent updates. And because of the simple power creep and honestly a lot of good stuff going for you, you have unique government types and lots of other stuff, despite the fact that you have, honestly, I think, better ideas out there available. I would just argue, stick with Persian ideas when you go for Aranshar. There we go, we'll go with that. And you have a much better game ahead of you. Yeah, I mean, own territory dice roll bonus. Who can really complain about that? So, with that said and done, I think we have our first entry into S tier. They're going to be joined by Persia later. That's a little bit of a spoiler for you, but I think that's not going to be too controversial. They're incredibly strong. And what else can I really say there? With that said, though, we move on to Ethiopia. It has some fun flavor. It has 10% core creation cost, which is okay, but again, there are better tags. It has a missionary in it, but okay, there are better tags for that. It has discipline. Most countries have discipline. And it has a relatively unique mission tree for buffing and playing around Coptic, which isn't a great religion, but at least it's fun to play around. It has some unique mechanics with moving your capital around and being able to recruit cover. Is it a campaign I think you should play and it's a fun one? Yes, I think it's genuinely a campaign worth playing. Is it a powerful tag, and is it honestly worth being an end tag for it? No, I don't think it is. And it's not as bad as the other colonial nations, but it could really use with some actual numerical buffs to make up for it. And Ethiopia, well, not the worst area to play in. Not Australia by any means of the imagination, isn't the most fun either in my experience. You're kind of playing almost a semi-Middle East campaign even further out of the way, where you're really just going into India or back up north into the Mamluk, Egypt areas for success anyway. And I guess when you're doing that, you'd normally want to go down south, so you have access to Zanzibar a bit earlier than those kind of builds and tags would have. So congratulations. With that said, though, I don't see these guys scoring anything above a C with any genuine, assessment of the situation. And with that said, we move on to France. Now, for those unaware, France is an end tag. This is a surprising amount of information about the amount of people that get this wrong. So they were on the same page. A lot of European tags used to be Eng tags, the most prominent one, of course, being Austria. Austria used to be an Eng tag, and in fact, Austria used to be only formable by Styria, which didn't exist at the game start, so the only way to actually become Austria if you didn't start as Austria was to release and play as Styria or Austria yourself. So it was very out of the way. However, a lot of countries dropped the Eng tag requirement relatively recently. One of them, however, was not the French, and that's probably a good thing because they have a lot going for them. The French are very powerful, and it pains me to say this. They did lose their 20% morale of armies that they had before, but knocked down to 15%, but they make up for it with an absolutely busted mission tree, including now a guaranteed reliable way of always integrating Burgundy, which is quite strong, and again mitigates a lot of RNG for the multiplayers, people that care about that. You get 50% war taxes cost, which you can combine at the tier 5 military reforms to get free war taxes, which is quite nice, and I would recommend you try a campaign around that. Running war taxes around all the time can save you quite a bit of money. It's 15% land maintenance and some other stuff with that, so it's quite good. Again, national manpower modifier is great, and you have a lot of options when playing France. You can go to HRE campaigns. It's a genuinely fun game. You're a pretty strong tag, so on top of just having a lot of options, even if you want to go colonial for whatever reason you want to do colonial as France, you have the combination of a lot of options with a pretty extensive mission tree and some good stuff going for you. Core creation cost, max abs is all great. You have your discipline, you even have your dev cost for those that care about that, and you have the combination of discipline and morale of armies in the same idea set, which is quite powerful. Again, it's very hard to underestimate France, and I think very few people are underestimating France in this nation set. To some extent, you can argue that France can have a formable. What I say to that is, what is it really forming, apart from the Holy Roman Empire, if it decides to go that way, and we'll get to them in a minute, promise, but with France, I think they're just a very solid tag, and they deliver pretty consistently. And for that reason, I'm going to be putting them in A tier. They deserve that spot pretty consistently, in my opinion. It's a good end tag, and it's a fun campaign. I've certainly played it a lot, mostly in multiplayer, but in single player as well. I had a couple France campaigns, would recommend. With that said, though, we move on to Germany. And this is where my assessment of military buffs in multiplayer kind of falls apart, because let's be honest, if you're forming Germany in multiplayer, the campaign's over and you've probably won, right? There's a huge amount of dev in Germany. Germany in general is also a very fun area to play as. Now, it's important to make a distinction that you're not forming Germany as the Holy Roman Empire here. This is if you form it by decision. The Holy Roman Empire Germany is a bit different, but this Germany is still an absolute monster. Your mission tree may be small, but it's powerful, and it has a lot of nice stuff inside of it. A lot of claims on pretty much Europe. You have 5% admin efficiency in your, well, ideas, which is great. You have 20% goods produced, which is probably the strongest single economic modifier you can get inside the default idea set. I'm looking at you, custom nations, your +2 flat goods produced, but yeah, 20% goods produced. Absolute beast. You get 10% tech cost, which is also quite nice, and the thing to bear in mind, though, is you do lose your Prussian military buffs. If you are going for pure military combat ability and stuff like that, I'd recommend a Prussia into Germany campaign where you lose the Prussian government, but maintain the Prussian ideas for the military buffs. With that, though, in single player, you probably want the admin efficiency from going Germany. You don't need that much of an overkill in terms of your military things. It's also quite a fun campaign and quite rewarding to form it because it's not that easy. There are a lot of tags against you, and you really need to either know your way around coalitions or spend a long time playing for the AE to go down and manage your way around that. It's also, if ever formed within EU4, technically been formed ahead of time. So it's a bit of a, congratulations, you did better than what was historically expected of you. Well done. With that said, though, it's an interesting tag. Again, when formed as Prussia, the military quality goes down. When formed as Austria, your diplomatic ability goes down because this is the Germany that is formed by military conquest. And the other thing that I think is important to mention with them is they don't have dev cost. So I find frequently with Germany, you're mainly forming them for the missions, but the ideas... There are basically other German regional powers that do what Germany does. That doesn't do what Germany does better, but more specifically, if you're looking for pure military buffs, you want Prussia. If you're looking for economy and dev costs and things like that, you're probably looking at something like Westphalia. If you're looking for a diplomatic monstrous powerhouse, you're probably looking at something like Austria. Which means that even though that individually you can look at this and go, they get a dip relation, that's nice. Oh, they get some admin efficiency, they get some goods produced and trade efficiency, that's nice. There are tags that do both those things better. I guess arguably not the economy part. So it's a bit of a weird placement in that regard, but it's very hard to underestimate the fact that he's, well, Germany, and a very fun campaign with that. So I think it's going to be not too much of an offense to be placing them also straight into S tier. I think Germany is honestly an enjoyable campaign, and one that is a pretty fancy one as a goal to form later on. With that said, though, we now move on to the UK. The default non-Angevin Empire, I form the UK. I give up my land on France mainland, I AFK on my island, press the dev button, colonize. Is that a unique way of playing? Absolutely. I mean, I've done a couple of my England campaigns in my run, got the achievement, all the fun stuff. If you're playing single player, I think Angevin Empire is better. If you're playing multiplayer, GB is stronger, and you're probably going to play it as GB because you just want to run away to your island and dev. But Angevin Empire is more fun. You're doing a lot more fighting. I think it's a lot more enjoyable. And for me, I think one of the other issues with Great Britain is you don't get a lot of military buffs. You just get a lot of economic buffs that, frankly, you don't need. Like, you don't need as much money as England makes. You're already on the best trade node in the game, and you have the potential to make that trade node insane, better than most other people. Like, for example, France is also have access to the English Channel if they conquer to it, but they don't have the potential to build up as much as England in terms of the ease that England can go and colonize something like the Cape or go into Norway. Again, France can do all those things, but it's a bit harder for it. And same for Germany. Germany is going to struggle to colonize something like the New World to feed into the English Channel as easy as the English are. So they're very good at making money. They don't need the extra 20% goods produced in the same way that Germany probably does. They get obscene amounts of naval buffs, but that's to be expected. And I guess that's holding them back because no one really does naval gameplay there. Is it a campaign that I would recommend you play? Yes. I think it's a campaign you should play at least once. It's a relatively unique campaign, playing GB. You know, sitting around and playing more, I guess, proactive tool. So you're not just sitting in Devon, you're also colonizing and conquering natives and doing New World stuff while not exactly involved in Europe directly. But I think a lot of adaptations are better, and if we don't look at it with rose-tinted glasses, I don't think the UK is that good of an end tag overall. It's very good at some very specific things. If you want to dev, if you want to get good money, but with that, and if you want to have a good colonial empire. But outside of good colonial empire, rich, and pressing the dev button, they don't really do much, which I guess as British people would argue is probably a good thing. But yeah, it's if you want to play the game, conquer places, and do those things, I don't think the UK is the pick for you. It's still very strong, so it's hard to put it anywhere below my current ranking, but I'm also going to be putting it, maybe somewhat controversially, near the top of B tier. With that said, let's move on to Hindustan. Now, I mentioned them earlier when we were talking about Bharat and India. This tag has a bit more military buffs going inside of it, and it has dev cost, which, again, I think is important to mention because for multiplayer that matters. You also pick up some gov capacity and manpower, which again, military buffs, but all of these things are going to cost you 5% admin efficiency. So for single player, I just recommend sticking with Bharat, or just, you know, forming it with your religion choices in mind. With that said, it's still basically just an India campaign, slightly reflavored into a more Muslim tone. So it's still good and, well, fun for lack of a better word. Bear in mind the placements inside the tiers aren't going to be that controversial, but I'm basically going to be putting it on par with Bharat. It's an India game. You just pick whichever one you want. Do you want the extra military buffs, or do you want the admin efficiency? If you want the military buffs, you form Bharat. If you want the military buffs, you form Hindustan. If you want the admin efficiency, you form Bharat. That's about it. There's not too much more to say about it. And with that said, now we move on to our next tag, the Holy Roman Empire. If there was a special tier, it would be this, because it's kind of a super end tag in the sense that pretty much every tag we've talked about before that isn't, well, Germany or I believe the Holy Roman Empire, or the Papal State also can't form it. But the Holy Roman Empire is, you can revoke and be it and have fun. France can go ahead and revoke into it. The ideas inside of it are good, is the best way of putting it. You have admin efficiency, you have 10 gov cap, not 15, but it's still good. You have core creation cost as well, which is just very nice. It's a brutal combination for conquest, core creation cost and admin efficiency. The gov cap never hurts. You get apostle policy, which is quite nice if you're running those. You get 1.5 legitimacy or devotion or whatever you are, or Horde Unity if you're going for HRE Horde, which I have to respect. And if you're going to Republic HRE, then 0.5 year Republican tradition are going to be very nice. In terms of military buffs, you pick up discipline and morale of armies. So in a weird way, Unless you're valuing the infantry combat ability more from the German option, I'd actually argue the Holy Roman Empire, given that its morale patch, actually has better military buffs than Germany, which is, I guess, unusual. It's very hard, however, to talk about the Holy Roman Empire's performance in multiplayer, because let's be honest, it never gets formed, unless you're doing a friendly campaign with your mates, in which case you're basically just playing single player spiced up. You're not forming the HRE in a competitive 30-odd player lobby, so I think that's not much point talking about it there. But for single player, yeah, it's a monster. It's another Germany. It's a better Germany almost. It's around Germany. You get a obscene amount of free cores when forming it. Most campaigns are literally centered around how fast you can do a revoke, doing a fast revoke, or dismantling the Holy Roman Empire so you can eat it manually. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. I mean, a lot of the power of something like Austria comes from the fact that they can get to the Holy Roman Empire so fast and use that to blob. So I think it's going to be not a very controversial statement when the Holy Roman Empire, as far as your Eng Tags, simply because it's so special and can be formed as anyone, is going to be going to S tier. Not too much surprises there. With that said, though, we move on to Italy. Oh, Italy. You are getting missions in the next update. That's going to be an interesting one. I'll have to see what those missions are. I'm hoping they're going to be good, but we'll have to, again, wait and see what's going on with that. Despite me saying that, though, they're not good. I mean, we know it's a meme to say the Italians are bad and all that things, but they're just not, well, good. They have 50% improved relations as a unique buff, which can be nice if you're conquering into AE heavy areas. My issue is by the time you've conquered enough land to form Italy, you've kind of demonstrated how you can conquer into AE heavy areas, so it's an extra tool to help with that. Otherwise, you don't really get much in terms of military bonuses. You get the same Byzantium minus 25% CCR, so you're not exactly bad. And you still pick up the, again, improved relations and ICA. So, you're just not good, is a better way of putting it. And in the current form, given your missions are... Honestly, I feel like something like the Tuscan or the Milanese missions, or the Sardinia-Piedmont missions, are just better. I won't go as far as saying the Neapolitan missions are better. I think the Italian missions are better than the Neapolitan missions, for example, but that's really not saying much. So I think you're just carried off by the fact that Italy is a good place to play in. It's a relatively rich area. Well, so I say it's a relatively rich area. It is a rich area. It's a decently devved area as well. Italy is very much carried by circumstances and the fact that nations that do form it have content to make up for its lack of content. In fact, a lot of the time when Italy is formed, I believe it's done so with Tuscan ideas, for example, which are, I think, just better. For context, it's a bit hard to compare the military buffs of Italy when it doesn't have the 5% discipline that is pretty standard in most of the other nations and their idea sets. So with that said, as an Eng Tag on your own, I feel like you don't really ever need to form it, right? If you're playing as Tuscany, you basically have everything you need out of Italy. You don't need to form it, and you can go and form another Eng Tag for your later pleasure. I think, honestly, Italy's pretty disappointing. I'm quite happy to get an update, but I think it's going to be going to the top of C tier, but I can't even imagine it in B. There are just better Eng Tag options, and putting Italy as your Eng Tag is a way of limiting yourself, I think, a bit too much. With that said, though, we move on to everyone's favorite, Japan. It's just good, right? There's a couple times when I would discuss things like Shinto, and I was mentioning that, hey guys, take a look at Shinto. It's not actually that strong. Shinto is only really strong because of the buffs that Japan get. Or I start talking about the other things that Japan gets that are relatively unique to them. But again, things like that, like I guess Shinto mechanics is the main one in that regard, that are not that strong, but because Japan is strong, you think that Shinto is strong. Japan is just really strong. It's a very fun, unique campaign at the start, going from the Sengoku Jidai. If you know what you're doing, it's quite powerful as well, because you can get like 5-6 humiliates off before you actually unite Japan. You get a lot of really powerful buffs, and you have a lot of options. You can go on your conquering spree across Asia and have fun with that. You know, that's a campaign option. You can make your giga strong troops and have a lot of buffs with your samurai, getting obscene amounts of troops. Military buffs, talking discipline or samurai units, very balanced. On top of discipline is all your normal ideas and other fun stuff. You even have some naval things going for you, which is somewhat rare, I guess, and has to be respected, but there we go. It's a lot of options. It's a very fun campaign. It's a very unique campaign as well with the early game Sengoku Jidai. And your religion has a lot of fun flavor stuff going around, and is, hey, got some nice military buffs on it as well. It's just a very nice tag, and it's very much carried by the fact that it has pretty obscene missions, and just a lot of really powerful stuff in it. With that said, though, I think it's not going to be a surprise to anyone that Japan will also be going into, well, S tier. And now we move on to Lotharingia. If you like playing Burgundy, you probably have done a Burgundy to Lotharingia campaign before. And I've done that as well. It's nice to get the achievement, of course. It's a unique campaign. It's not trivial because France can fight back. My issue with Lotharingia is that their national ideas are just worse than the Burgundian ideas. Like, you are just better off stick on the Burgundian ideas. And when you do form Lotharingia, your game plan after forming it and killing France is you are just playing France. Right? Your ambitions, geopolitical areas of expansion, you know, your main rivals, you are just doing a France campaign with extra steps. And you don't get a lot from doing Burgundy to Lotharingia compared to just playing as France. What I mean by that is, for example, you can play a campaign into Russia, where you start as Muscovy and you get some stuff. Or if you want to try a Republic, you can go do Novgorod into Russia, where you have a much weaker early game, for sure, but you make up for that by being a Republic, and that's cool. You don't really get any of that as Lotharingia. You don't get anything to make up for the fact that your start was significantly worse than the French start. So it's a weird situation with that. Your missions and ideas aren't amazing. You're not too good, and I guess my main issue is that in terms of unique playstyles, the uniqueness ends when this tag is formed, and when it's formed, you're like, well, great, I'm playing a France campaign. And so for this reason, lack of relatively unique things going for you, and the relatively lackluster performance in terms of just, you know, sticking with Burgundian ideas compared to other options, I honestly can't put it above, well, C tier. I mean, again, this is a nation set which has military buffs, like your 50 morale of army is great, and 10 IC8, but you don't have discipline inside of them. You get 20% CCR, but other countries do conquest better. You get some HRE mechanics, but other countries like France do all that better. You are just playing a worse France, and I think the existence of France, in the same way that the existence of Poland's hold back Commonwealth's power, the existence of France hold back Lotharingia's. And now we move on to another end tag that also exists at game start. The Ming. It's a fun campaign. You do start filthy rich. You start with a lot going for you in terms of that. Those things, it can be almost a bit too easy in the sense that you can, if you know what you're doing, run really strong advisors right off the bat, and you have a lot of manpower and a lot of money to work with. A lot of land to conquer. Your missions are very word heavy, I think is the best way to summarize it. There's a lot of flavor and things going on with them, but be ready to read half an essay. And I guess that's kind of a good summary of the nation as well, overall. You have unique estates, you have a lot of unique content around that. You also start with 25% minimum autonomy, which you reform out of eventually. But it's still there and does hold you back a bit. It's very powerful in the hands of the player, because you are basically able to fully utilize its economy and all the other buffs to its full extent. You have the Mandate of Heaven, very unique mechanic. You have the eunuchs, very unique mechanics, and a lot of other things like that. Confucian is also a religion that plays quite well with the Ming, and obviously the Confucian are the Ming because of your harmonizations. It's a fun campaign. It's a decent campaign. It's just if you're going to play China, I feel like it's more fun to play either a horde that conquers China, that then becomes something like the Mongol horde and keeps their horde ways, or a horde that conquers China and settles down, because it kind of makes China a reward and not just something that you start with and can pretty much get rid of all the debuffs of being the Ming by like 15-10. So it's a weird campaign. You're very, also again, tributary heavy somewhat, but you are quite powerful. I don't think you have as much going for you as some of the other tags in terms of enjoyment, and I think a large part of that is there is an inherent bit of fun in EU4 with the early game and the challenge of the early game, and you just don't get that. You're already in a position where anyone individually around you can just smack around relatively trivially. So I think that almost holds it back in some cases. But it has to be respected as a pretty powerful nation nonetheless, with a lot of late game buffs that you can pick up if you're willing to go ahead and do the missions for them. And for that reason, I think it's going to be earning its position in B tier. With that said, we now move on to Mexico. The first thing I'm going to say with Mexico is that when you form it, your first idea that you get is rebuilding Mexico, which I conceptually love. Like, what are you rebuilding? You just formed the thing. Congratulations. Like, you've just reformed the country. Why are you rebuilding it? You haven't built it in the first place. But hey, it's 10% construction cost. Unfortunately, with that small joke aside, they have nothing going for them again. If you want to play in the area, play the Aztecs. If you want to play in the area again, play something like the Mayans. They're getting more content in the recent updates as well. Mexico is just not good. I think it's the best way of summarizing it. You lose access to the colonial nation torrents of religions. It's even more crippling in this area because there's a lot of natives you've probably conquered, so they're going to be causing a lot of issues for you if you're not playing around them. Your ideas aren't great, you're not getting missions. It's just sadness all around. And again, you have no discipline, you have no military buffs, you lose the dev cost you get from being a colonial nation, for crying out loud. And to make up for that, you get what? 15% manpower recovery and 15 global settlers, some yearly inflation reduction. Great. I don't see that making up for it, but if you say so. It's very much, definitely a very neglected tag, and for that reason I think... I mean, you've probably noticed a trend here in terms of countries that we're putting into D tier. This is basically the colonial nation D tier that doesn't have any content. So with that said and done, not much more to say about Mexico. We now move on to the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire. Well, it's basically the tag you play if you're playing a horde. If you're playing a horde, you're going to do a world conquest, conquer the world as a horde, burn down the whole thing to the ground. You're trying to do your cavalry LARP, Genghis Khan enjoyers, all those things. That's the Mongol horde for you. Doesn't come with unique ideas. Comes with a great Mongol state reform though, so that's nice. You don't have to be Tangri to do the Mongol Empire, by the way. You can keep your religion when forming it, though most of the time you're probably doing some horde LARP, so you're probably Tangri. And yeah, go conquer your world. I find the Mongol Empire in a weird way though, is that as an end tag, it's almost a reward end tag in the sense of, congrats, you've done horde and you've done horde good. Here's your funny formable. It doesn't come with too many unique buffs that really excel in the same way something like revoking the HRE or forming Japan comes with from their mission tree. But it's still very strong, and it's a very unique campaign. You are doing a Mongol ruin the world, burn it to the ground, cavalry horde roleplay again, as mentioned before. And even in multiplayer, it's not exactly weak. Horde ideas are pretty decent at well conquering, so much so that it makes up for their complete lack of economy in the process. It's good, but I think there's no other way around it. It's just good. I think there are other candidates for S tier that are better than the Mongol Empire, since it's mostly a cosmetic formable. But as a mere achievement of your recognition, and as just a fun thing to strive for, as yes, we restored the Mongol horde, I think for basically those two reasons alone, I'm going to be putting it into A tier, where it, well, deserves its placement. Yeah, let's put it near Byzantium. I think that's a pretty decent place. With that, sir, we move on to the Mughals. Yeah, they're good. I think there's no beating around it, they're good. In my opinion, I think Mughals are the best tag as of current patch still to World Conquest. On top of that, they are getting a new mission tree again in the new update, which would be insane. You're buffing the tag that already has Mughal assimilation, for crying out loud. In terms of even multiplayer performance, you still have your access to your discipline, and you have a free military policy, which can be quite nice for basically running some extra military policies, or when you are at the late game situation where you're running 4 mil policies anyway, or 3 mil policies anyway, it's going to save you a mil point, so that's more generals, that's more breaching walls. You know, it's nice and shouldn't be knocked down a peg. Otherwise, in terms of your single player prowess, it's obscene. 25% co-creation cost is really, really good. You get some tech costs, which helps you catch up if there's ever an issue, and some idea costs will help you fill out your ideas faster. Again, your main bonus though is your missions are pretty obscene. You can also go ahead and get 10 admin efficiency by releasing the Khan and then just annexing them later. So that's just there, which is why I think they're really, really good. Basically, they have everything going for them for conquering the universe. And for that reason, I think they are still, to this day, the best tag to World Conquest with, because they are the greatest at actually preventing revolt. See, the -1 national unrest inside their ideas is very deceptive. because they actually get quite a lot of other ways of dealing with them. Namely, if you go humanist, you can just not worry about converting things and, well, maintain really high tolerance of everyone anyway. Or if you go religious, you can convert to everyone on top of that and basically run around with something like 1000% overextension and very minimal revolts. Because of assimilation. You don't care about promoted culture groups if every single person becomes a promoted culture group. And instead of just being a burden, conquering a new territory and having wrong culture groups, you actually get buffs by conquering them. And this is where something like the 25% CCR reduction, which is already really strong inside their opening ideas, is kind of deceptive. Because one of the first things you do when you do form the Mughals is you conquer their starting area around them. And the culture group you do get from conquering your, well, almost primary culture, if that makes sense. Hindustani is another 10% core creation cost. So you're running with like 35% core creation cost very early on. If you combine that with admin, you're spending very minimal points on coring. It's quite powerful and should not be neglected. 60% core creation cost is really, really good. Saves you a huge amount of admin points. You get access to admin efficiency later. Again, Mughal assimilation. It's a monster. No one can knock that down a peg. And I think simply because of its single player prowess and its ability to hold its own in multiplayer, Mughals are also going to S tier. The thing I think is also important to mention with Mughals is that forming them does change your tech group into Indian. That can be a surprise, but usually I find is that Indian isn't the worst tech group. So when it is being formed, it's normally like, oh nice, okay, at least I'm Indian, I'm not going to be one of the worst middle groups like something like African. But it's something to bear in mind. It's one of the few ways you do have access to actually changing your military groups in current patch. There's a couple more recently that came out. We're talking about domination for giving Russia the ability to westernize. We'll get to Russia in a minute. Boy, we'll get to Russia. And we've got the Egypt ability to change their unit types to western as well. But yeah, no, Mughals straight up change your tech group, whatever you were, to Indian, and that's, I think, good to know. If you're looking for purely that ability, Rajasthan is technically better since they're not an N tag. But again, it's just something that's, I think, worth mentioning with the Mughals. And with the Mughals done and dusted, we move on to the Ottomans. Everyone's favourite tag. The Ottomans are a monster. Situationally, they're incredibly powerful. They're really set up to conquer a lot of areas around them. They have really, really good missions. They have really powerful missions. They have a lot of flavour inside of them. They have access to the eyeless mechanic, which are quite good. Their government unique mechanics are excellent. And their ideas are, again, really good. Another 25% core creation cost really helps. Not as good as the Mughals, but again, the Mughals are exemplars of their own right. The thing is with the Ottomans, wonderful land to scale into. Wonderful land to fight with. Just, you have pretty much everything going for you. I don't think I need to be too much of an explanation as to why Mughals are, well, an S tier end tag. That's a pretty deserved placement. I guess the only thing with the Ottomans that needs to be mentioned is you can't really form them. They're not formable. So, you are going to have to start playing as the Ottomans to use them, but that's that. They're not exactly starting in a weak position, is all I will say. So, yeah, it's a good end tag. Not sure what else to say. It's the Ottomans. I feel like the placement of Ottomans in S and Byzantium in A though is going to annoy some people, but I'm sorry. That's all I will say. I'm sorry. With that said, though, we move on to Persia. If you don't know why I'm putting it in S tier, just basically it's Arashem but better. You have monstrous ideas. You have monstrous buffs to your country. You get a lot of dev cost going for you as well. You're inside arguably one of the best trade nodes in the game. Well, the best trade node is, of course, the English Channel, but Persia is a monstrous trade node on its own as well. You have access to a huge amount of the Indian trade. It's just excellent positioning, a lot of unique buffs, quite a lot of powerful things going for you. Persia's an excellent tag, and again, I'm justifying it here, but yeah, it's near Arashim, so I should probably drag them more down here. I think this is probably a more accurate re-evaluation of this area, if it was up to me. But yeah, if you want to see why Persia's up in S, it's basically the same reasons as Aranasham. It's just really good. Your ideas are monstrous as well. Just on the same page, we're talking about a military idea set that has access to 50 morale of armies, as well as 5 discipline, so it's already on par with things like France. But you're getting 15% manpower. You're getting 15% manpower recovery speed and 10% recover army morale speed as well. So you get huge amounts of military quantity, morale, and morale recovery rate buffs, and even some cavalry combat ability to really tie the whole thing together. It's just really, really strong. There's no better way of putting it. You have your dev cost, even if it's only 5, but again, you get more from your missions, and other shenanigans, you get production efficiency and goods produced. It's just good. There's no two ways around it. There's even some national tax to really tie the whole thing together, but that's more redundant than anything. With that said, though, we now move on to the Qing. It's a China campaign that involves playing as a horde first. I think it's a more enjoyable China campaign. You do get some banner gameplay, which is kind of unique and has to be rated for that, and you do get admin efficiency inside of your ideas, so you're certainly a bit better than the China versions, but you're not that great as well, so it's a weird one. You have your core creation cost, you have admin efficiency, so you're still a monster of conquest, let's be absolutely clear here, but it's a China game. You're going to be filthy rich, you're playing as China. Yeah, there's not too much around it. I respect it a bit more, though, because you didn't start as, well, the Ming, but hey. In terms of entire content, you're just a Manchurian tribe settling down and conquering China. Not much more to say there. And for that reason, I think it's not going to be too surprising if I'm putting an A. It's just good and strong. But, yeah, it's just good. It's consistently good. It's not overly amazing like some of the other tags. But it's very good at what it does. And what it does is a nice campaign. But now we move on to the Roman Empire. It's just good. I feel like I've said that a lot today, but it's Eng Tags tier list. What do you expect? Very few. If a country is here and it's mediocre, it's knocking it down to C and D tier. D tier for your actual bad ones. Rome is a monster. You get a huge amount of flavor with your Senate and SPQR government reforms. You get admin efficiency and government reform again. You get discipline. You get pretty impressive 20% stab cost reduction, which, by the way, can be quite nice stab cost reduction for mitigating large overextension amounts. But with that said, 5% admin efficiency in your ideas for imperial bureaucracy plus 5% in government reform is scary. -2 unrest is good. You get 25% CCR and years of separatism, 33% manpower to really just help your legions be filled. You even get some forcemen infantry common ability, and it's just, yeah, it's just good. Everything that Rome has is good. That's going for it. There's not much point talking about Roman multiplayer. You're not forming Roman multiplayer. If you are forming Roman multiplayer, it's a chill lobby, because any serious lobby where you are in a situation where you can reasonably form Rome has already concluded, because you've already won the game, so there's not much point discussing it there. And for single player, it's a monster. Parliament is really strong right now. You get access to it with the Senate, so even better. Everything you have is good for conquest. Everything you have is good for LARP. It's just an excellent tag. Definitely up there with the Mughals, and it makes up for the other issues, namely that if you are playing as France, you can go ahead and form Rome as well. It's a super end tag, as mentioned before. With Rome now mentioned, we move on to the Rozwi Empire. Why is this an end tag? Like genuinely, why is this an end tag? From my understanding, when it was released, a lot of people in the dev diaries mentioned this as the Prussia of Africa. Only it wasn't, right? You get 10 morale of armies, 10 infantry common ability, and 5 discipline. Okay, the discipline is consistent with Prussia, but you don't get the militarization. And you get half the ICA of Prussia and 10 morale of armies, half the morales of Prussia. So not really. The infantry cost is nice as well, I guess, but it's not that big of a deal. The construction cost certainly doesn't hurt. And your final finish is -10 shock damage received. Which, I mean, there's just better things out there. You don't have too much unique things going for you. It's not an awful tag, but it really does not deserve to be an end tag in my opinion. And just fails in comparison in any kind of weight to everyone around them. C tier, and not much more debate around that. It's no Mexico or Canada, but it's not completely awful. And yeah, that's the best way of putting it. I'll be honest, I don't think many people, if at all, have played Rozwi, the Rozwi Empire. If you have, honestly, do tell me in the comments. I'm curious. Has anyone actually played this tag? That'd be good to know. With that said, though, we move on to Rum. Have you conquered the Ottoman Empire and want to form the Ottomans, but you can't? So you form the next best thing? Yeah, that's Rum. It's basically I want to form the Ottomans, we have the Ottomans at home. You get 5% less core creation cost. You make up for that with a bunch of construction costs. There's a couple fun, unique achievements, and it's really carried by the fact that it kind of borrows a lot of the Ottoman content, so your Janissary estates and all those other things. So it's kind of a very much a, I formed the Ottomans at home. It was a classic to form as the Mamluks back in the day. Now Mamluks are pretty strong and can just go form Egypt and have fun, I guess. On that regard, now that Egypt got buffed. So it's a weird, exists in a weird spot. I think Rum mainly exists for something like Caraman playthroughs, to be 4 minutes. But yeah, I mean, it's not bad. 20% CCR is nothing to be scoffed at, but it's no monster as some of the other nations mentioned above. It's a consistently reasonable tag, and I guess my main critique of it is that it's a tag that borrows content from the Ottomans, so very much suffers from the same issues as Lotharingia or the Commonwealth. If you're going to play Rum, just play the Ottomans. It's just a better version of it. So for that reason, it's going to go into B tier. With that said, though, we move on to our next tag, Russia. A country that has really benefited from the recent power creeps. This tag is a monster. You open CCR co-creation costs and you get a bunch of manpower. Siberian Frontiers is completely busted and broken. You get some of the best land force modifiers in the game, 33%. Used to be 50%, but again, a lot of force buffs got nerfed, so you can maintain huge amounts of armies. You get an AE reduction like it matters, which is surprisingly unique for a lot of end tags. A lot of them realize that AE doesn't matter at this point, but hey, I guess you can have some. And you even pick up some military buffs as well. 5% morale of armies is kind of an insult, but the fire damage received is nice. You also get some material combat ability, which isn't bad as well. And hey, 10% advisor cost, hey, can save you a bit of money. The Russian missions, however, are completely busted. Especially if you're doing Muscovy into Russia. You can pop like 40 morale if you need it in multiplayer. In terms of single player, though, you get huge amounts of claims on everything. And I think it's important to also, if you're doing Muscovy into Russia, your first mission, you can either get permaclaims or you can get another. Well, I think it's 20 or 25 or 15% core creation cost. Whatever it is, whichever option you choose, that's until the end of the game. So when you do form Russia, you get to keep both of those buffs. So Russia plus Administrative Ideas kind of almost borders the Mughals with the amount of core creation cost you're getting, which is pretty obscene. And again, would recommend. A lot of really good, powerful buffs for them. They get 5% discipline until the end of the game as well from their missions, especially the ability to reform into Western units is good. Huge amounts of military buffs, huge amounts of everything going for them. They're a monster, and they were really strong before, and Domination just, I think, way too overbuffed them in terms of the features they have going for them. They still remain as one of the dominant powers in EU4 and their timeline, which I guess is somewhat accurate. So yeah, it's an S tier for me. With that said, though, we move on to Scandinavia. It's a weird one, because Scandinavia is strong. Very nice missions, a lot of really good buffs, and, well, 5% admin efficiency is really good. You also get 0.5 cavalry 5 if you want to go that way. My issue is that if you are going to build around cavalry, Lithuania or Poland just south of you is better for that. So it's a very weirdly placed cavalry fire pip, but it's a thing. You keep the Swedish 20% ICA, which I guess is nice. You get 15% goods produced and discipline, so those are great. Your main unique buff, however, is the global possible number of buildings +1, which is very strong, and I think it should not be underestimated for that. And your missions are still, well, quite fun and quite unique. A lot of very fleshed out content. Thing is, with Scandinavia, it used to be a complete meme. It basically did nothing and was quite weak until they got an update, I believe, in Lines of the North and became an actually reasonable formable that you actually go ahead and form. So yeah, that's it's kind of a sting. And if I did this tier list 2 or 3 years ago, so not 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 patches ago, it would be an S tier without a doubt. But there's so many new tags that are just better that got overbuffed. Your Japans, your Persias, the Ottoman buffs, Russia buffs. They are on such a higher level than what Scandinavia has going for it. It almost made the earlier power creep of the Scandinavia buffs and all their unique stuff seem reasonable. Like, it's just a very nice tag, but it's not as obscene as some of the stuff the Ottomans get nowadays. So, with the context of the recent power creep, I think they're going to be pretty comfortably sitting in A tier. Near the top, I think, for certain. But yeah, in A tier is the best I can offer them. With that said, though, we now move on to Spain. Now, I did talk about them briefly a while back when I talked about Andalusia. I think Spain is a very fun campaign, and they have a lot going for them. Morale of armies and artillery buff and discipline is just very nice for your ability to fight. You also have access to tercias, which are a monster, and your missions are very extensive and very fleshed out. I mean, again, so far just praises, right? They are inherently a colonizing nation, and I don't like playing colonial tags, as you can probably tell by the placements so far. I think the best way of colonizing is letting someone else do it and then conquering your colonies. With that said, though, I think Spain is definitely one of the nicer colonial tags to play, because as opposed to colonizing on the side, you can, well, colonize on the side and still maintain pretty decent armies because of your tercios and all of your other military buffs you get from being Spain. and your expansion opportunities are there. The campaign can be quite different. You still have to fight the Moroccans, and the French and other things like that, so you're not exactly sitting around waiting for a colony to finish, looking at you, Portugal. And again, it's a quite extensive mission tree that can be quite fun, with a lot of buffs going for you. Very Catholic focused, which again can be quite good, because again, that's for your flavor options. I think they're a very enjoyable campaign. They are slightly outshined by the monstrous power creep from the recent updates, even though they have a decent chunk of it themselves. But it's just, yeah. I can't see any placement for them that goes above B tier. It's based on par with the UK in terms of their campaign. It's a decent one, but it could be better. Now, is this saying that again that they're a bad tag? No. It's just compared to the other end tags, they are not as amazing as some of the other options. I think they're still a very strong country, as I mentioned before, but I just struggle justifying anything above a B tier. With that said, we move on to the Pope. The Pope, I should have really done like a unique tier for something like Rome or, well, now the Pope, but the Pope is very unique. It's kind of Paradox's don't break this tag, where you're really not meant to do things as the Pope, you're not meant to be able to form things as the Pope, you're not meant to get out of the Pope reforms, you're not meant to be able to, well, get rid of the tier 1 Pope reform, stop being the Pope and all these other things. And even though it has got a bit of content recently with their Kingdom of God missions and almost a co-op campaign with France, where France can make the Pope their march and give them some buffs at the end of the game and so on and so on. They're just not good as an end tag. They are one of the starting end tags in the game, but starting end tags like the Ottomans and France make up for it by starting in a very strong position. This is another thing that's holding Ethiopia back. It doesn't really have anything to form outside of Axum because of its starting end tag position. So it's kind of been held back in that regard, and for what? You don't even guarantee being the Curia controller of the time because you are the Pope. It's just, yeah, it's a weird campaign. It's definitely more interesting than colonial nations, but honestly, I think things like Lotharingia, Ethiopia, and Italy are just better than it, and better than it categorically. So I think it goes at the top of D tier, but yeah, that's the best I'm going to have to give it there. I'm sorry. It's just not a good end tag to actually break. It's a good end tag to... Sorry, it's not a good end tag to actually play. It's a great end tag to break, that's what I was thinking about, because it's almost a challenge. You're very tended to not break the Pope end tag. But in terms of playing it conventionally and playing it, it's just not enjoyable enough. Not a lot of military buffs that you have, or a lot of, well, unique buffs. You do still have your discipline, which I guess is nice, but 10% AE near the end of your ideas. Some cost to fabricate claims. Religious unity really is the Pope. You're not going to struggle with religious unity expanding into Italy. That place stays Catholic all the time. It's just a very underwhelming idea set and mission tree, to be honest. So I think it's near the top of D tier, certainly better than the other candidates in D tier, but I can't put it higher than that. With that said, though, we move on to the United States of America. It has one thing in it, inside of its ideas, that are unique enough to actually justify forming this tag. Minus 10 minimum autonomy territories, because it is the Empire of Liberty, which means it's really good at crushing people's autonomy. I find that really ironic, is that the whole thing with America is that it's the Bill of Rights, it's super free, woo, freedom, fireworks, woo, really good at keeping people's autonomy down, really good at keeping everyone in line, very, very good at autonomy oppression. I find that kind of ironic. It's not awful, 50% goods produced as well isn't bad, and you do pick up 50% Marine force limit without any buffs to Marines. The other thing you do get is freedom of religion, giving you 5 tolerance of heretics. Sounds amazing. Tiny issue with that. Tolerance of heretics is capped, so you've just hid the cap out of one idea. Second of all, instead of this tolerance of heretics, I'd rather just have heretics and heathen provinces don't generate unless, like every other colonial nation. You've also, again, lost your dev cost that you get from being a colonial nation, and you've gained, what, the White House, and you've gained 10-minute autonomy territories, not a lot of unique buffs. You get a couple small events, and there's a bit of gameplay around it because America is a country where a lot of people live, and hence a country that a lot of people want to play. But with that said, it's just not good. Right? Minimum autonomy territories means it's a nice pit stop if you're building around that. Otherwise, it's better than every other colonial nation. I'll give you that. That's where the praise stops, unfortunately. I'm going to be putting you below the Pope in terms of enjoyability as well. With that said, before my entire YouTube channel gets blown away by people screaming freedom, let's move on to the second to last end tag, Yuan. It's a horde that conquers China. Plays very similar to Qing, to be honest, from my experience. Yeah. CCR inside your ideas. You get admin efficiency inside your ideas. And what's nice with it, you get some gov cap and some movement speed, which is actually, I find, quite enjoyable. Going for movement speed, but it's a thing. Nothing we haven't mentioned in terms of China campaigns before. If you haven't played it, but you've played Qing and you've played Ming, you don't need to play it. You've kind of played what's there to play, I think is the best way of putting with it. Is it a strong tag? Yes. Is it very unique compared to the other ones? Not really. I think it sits comfortably in B tier, near the other mandate. I think Qing is a bit more fun at it, because at least they get the Manchu, at least they get the Manchu banners to play around with, a bit more than than Yuan does. Otherwise, it's a thing. You can form the Mongol Empire later. That's good to know, but yeah. I think Qing has again been held up to a higher tier of A because of its access to the to your what are they called? They're like unique unit, the Manchurian what are they called? Forgot the name of it. The banners, yes. Because you have access to banners, and as Yuan, I believe your missions give you access to some banners temporarily. But again, it's just kind of a sadder Qing, in my opinion. It's at least, I think it would be more fair to put it near this. I still respect a Yuan game more than I respect a Ming game, because at least you've conquered to form it. But, I guess the good news is you're not really needing to conquer all of China. You can form it relatively early into your conquest of China, and you do stay as a horde compared to Qing settling down. So it's definitely an intermediary step towards the Mongol Empire, but it's not even the required intermediary step, I think is the best way of saying it. So yeah, go for it. I would say it's a unique campaign. If you haven't played with hordes or anyone in that area, I'd recommend them, but they're not that amazing. And it just goes to show how high the standards are for the Eng Tags, because a nation with 5% admin efficiency has been marked as not that amazing. And again, 25% of core creation cost. With that said, though, we move on to our final option, Zimbabwe. Mutapa can form it. The Rozwi Empire, which we talked about earlier, can also form it if they do a mission. It's okay. The missions are okay. They have some content. It's not great. You get trade efficiency. You get some morale of armies. Some less buffs. The main cool thing you have going for you, I guess, is the 15% construction cost, which is a bit better than the 10% you normally get, but it's not really enough to call home about. I like stacking modifiers. I like construction cost specifically because it's like, ooh, I can get my manuals online earlier, whatever. But I'm not gonna play an entire campaign to form Zimbabwe for 15% construction cost. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. And again, I don't think it's one of those tags that got played a lot either. It's not weak inherently. You still have your goods produced, but it's just really subpar. You're not forming it for its over-the-powered missions. You're not forming it for its over-the-powered ideas. I mean, again, it doesn't actually have discipline inside of it, just 10 morale. So that's already a step back. It's just honestly quite a sad formable. In terms of ideas, I would say just stick with the Rozwi Empire. But yeah, Zimbabwe is going to be going honestly below the US in terms of its utility. It's just you can form it if you want your flag to be a bit more white, I guess. I mean, they've got the same little creature on it. But with that said, however, that's going to be, well, the end of the tier list. So here you go. As you can see it, there it is for you. Enjoy it. I would say debate me in the comments about the placements, but there's not much point saying it. I know you will. So with that said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.